Welcome, everyone. Very pleased to have you with us here today for, I believe, our 37th episode of This Is CDR. This Is CDR is an online event series presented by OpenAir to explore the wide range of carbon removal solutions currently being researched, developed, and deployed, and to contextualize them for policy proposals being advanced in New York and other states and jurisdictions worldwide. My name is Toby Bryce, based in Brooklyn, New York, and I work on policy advocacy and market development with OpenAir. Just some quick background on OpenAir. We're a distributed volunteer network dedicated to the advancement of carbon removal solutions essential to solving the climate crisis. Our growing global community collaborates on shared open source missions in the areas of policy advocacy, research and development, and activist CDR market development. There'll be some links in the chat to sign up for our group, and we'd love to have you join us. There's plenty of fun work to do, and we can definitely, as everyone knows, we need all hands on deck with respect to carbon removal. Before we start, just to contextualize what we're talking about, a quick definition of what we mean when we say carbon removal. It's purposeful human activity to remove CO2 from the atmosphere and to durably store it in geological, terrestrial, or ocean reservoirs or in long-lived products. One important thing to call out up front when we talk about carbon removal is that it is an essential climate solution, but it is in no way, shape, or form any sort of substitute for reducing global greenhouse gas emissions as quickly and as completely as possible, full stop. So we have to absolutely reduce emissions, and carbon removal is not an excuse not to remove emissions or any reason to go more slowly. We have to do both and accelerate both as quickly as possible. That said, there's clear scientific consensus that carbon removal is required for us to meet our climate goals, including expressed most recently in very stark terms in the IPCC AR6 Working Group 3 report. That we are going to need billions of tons of carbon removal being deployed by mid-century. And that's an immense volume. We're nowhere near it right now. We're in the tens of thousands of tons of durable carbon removal annually. So we really need to step up this activity and scale as quickly as possible in the coming decades. Now, on to today's session, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Megha Raghavan, who is going to talk a little bit more about the run of show and introduce today's presenters.
Hi, everyone. I'm Megha. I'm an OpenAir member in London, working on some policy opportunities out in California, where I'm from. So some quick housekeeping notes. Our format is going to be a quick presentation, 15 to 20 minutes, followed by a few prepared questions, and then we'll have some moderated audience Q&A. So as we go along, please type any questions you have into the Q&A box in Zoom. Note that that's separate from the chat box, so make sure you find the right one. The event is also being recorded, so we'll send the video link to everyone who registered, and we will post it to OpenAir's website and to our YouTube channel. This week on This Is CDR, we're very happy to welcome Carbin Minerals CEO Paul Needham and Chief Science Officer Dr. Greg Dipple to tell us how the X Prize Milestone Award-winning company's science and technology accelerate natural mineralization processes to unlock the enormous carbon removal potential of mine tailings. Paul Needham is the CEO of Carbin Minerals. He's a cleantech serial entrepreneur with 20 years of experience as a founder, CEO, and board member. Paul also currently serves as a board member and senior advisor to energy access companies, financing facilities, and impact investment funds that are accelerating the energy transition in the developing world. Paul co-founded and led Simpa Networks, which is the leading rooftop solar leasing company in India. Simpa was acquired by ENGIE in November 2018. Paul has an MPhil in economics and politics from the University of Cambridge. Greg Dipple is Carbin Minerals Chief Science Officer and a professor of geological sciences at the University of British Columbia. Dr. Dipple studies the processes and driving forces for mineral fluid reactions, including those that modulate long-term climate through chemical weathering. He's published extensively on fluid rock interactions from the deep earth to its surface. Through field experimental and modeling studies, he and his students and postdocs have demonstrated that weathering of alkaline mine wastes are vastly accelerated over background weathering rates and impact the short-term carbon cycle. Current work focuses on industrial control of these processes for carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Dr. Dipple has worked at the University of British Columbia since 1992. He's served as a department head and associate dean and in administrative roles for the Mineral Deposit Research Unit and the Bradshaw Research Institute for Minerals and Mining. So I will hand it over to our presenters now whenever you two are ready.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to talk today a little bit about Carbin Minerals. We get some slides going here. Can you see that okay? Great.
Yep,
So I'm
looks
Greg
great.
Dipple. I'll go through a few slides here, and then we'll open things up to question and answer. So here to talk about Carbin Minerals. Carbin Minerals is a company that we've spun out of the University of British Columbia just in the past year. It's building on a couple decades of research on the weathering, accelerated weathering of mine waste for capturing CO2 from the atmosphere and mineralizing it within tailings storage facilities. And what we thought we would do for the talk today is talk a little bit about the company, but also provide some of the science around the approach that we're taking. So this is maybe a little bit of a hybrid approach versus some of the past talks that you've had here in OpenAir, where there's been either a company focus or a science focus. We're trying to do a little bit of both today. So hopefully that will work. So I think this probably doesn't really need an introduction, but our motivation here is really around recognizing the problem we have about carbon removal from the atmosphere and its importance in addition to reducing CO2 emissions. And the size of the problem that we have on the timescale of the coming decades is huge. And we strongly believe that there is an opportunity in using waste streams to help to accomplish some part of this overall larger target. So we work specifically with the mining industry. In particular, a number of commodity types are hosted within ultramafic rocks. And I think on some of the other presentations you've had in this series, you've seen other people talking about the reactivity of ultramafic rocks. We're focused specifically on the mining of ultramafic rocks for commodities, especially commodities that are going to be important for the transformation of our energy sector and our transportation sector. So we know that some types of these deposits are hosted in ultramafic rocks, which are inherently highly reactive. The extraction process and the extraction of the metals provides a finely ground feedstock, which can be used to greatly accelerate the reactions that capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store them within magnesium carbonate minerals. This slide from the International Energy Agency really highlights some of the challenges that we're going to see as a society if we want to move to renewable electricity and to electrification of our transportation sector. In particular, this shows the increase in amount of mining that's going to be needed to supply critical and battery metals by 2040 over 2020 levels. And so what I would call your attention to in particular in the light green, for example, we work a lot with nickel companies. We're looking at an increase in the rate of nickel mining between 6 to 19 times 2020 levels by 2040, depending on different development scenarios. So we're seeing a huge increase in the demand for these metals, which is necessary for the deployment of renewable electricity and for electrification of the transport sector. And our goal is to partner with the mining companies that produce these metals to help to decarbonize the supply chain of these metals for their deployment, but also we believe there is a pathway here to actually develop carbon negative mining for some of these metals. And the scale of the opportunity here is quite large. If you take these numbers and look at the amount of alkaline mine waste that might be produced from mining of these metals, we're looking at hundreds of millions of tons per year and into the gigatons by 2050 plus if all of those tailings were reacted and sequestering carbon dioxide. So we want to capture a part of that opportunity. So our approach as a company here is building out of a lot of research, and we have essentially two components that we're organized around within Carbin Minerals. So our goal as a company is to partner with operating mines, work within their tailings storage facility to enhance and optimize the rate of CO2 capture in their tailings and mineralization. And this uses a number of technologies that we've developed, and we look to accelerate the rates of those reactions over the baseline rates that exist naturally by a factor of 5 to 50-fold. And that really presents then the opportunity to not only help to eliminate the carbon footprint of mining, but also provide carbon removal as one of the products of the mining of these metals. So we have two technologies. We have a lot of work that we do within the tailings storage facility, which is essentially drop-in technology that can operate with relatively little interruption to the mining process. But we also have a number of other technologies coming through the research stream that help to activate or enhance the reactivity of tailings such that the drop-in technology that we do within the tailings storage facility becomes greatly enhanced in both its rate and its capacity to store CO2. So we're essentially taking these tailings, we're helping modify them and set them up for maximum CO2 reactivity, and then we monitor and manipulate the tailings within the tailings storage facility to enhance the rate of carbon capture and mineralization within the tailings storage facility. The ultimate fate of the carbon in this instance then stays within the tailings storage facility along with the tailings and becomes part of the landscape in the long term. The process that we're looking at here is similar to the other ones that we would have seen in this series around using ultramafic rocks for mineralizing CO2. We're taking metals or cations from minerals, in particular magnesium, because we focus on ultramafic rocks. We combine that with carbon dioxide, in particular, in this case, carbon dioxide reacting directly from the air, and we form thermodynamically stable magnesium carbonate minerals as a storage mechanism. So we've seen this graphic in some of the other talks in this series as well. For our technology, we're really focusing on the idea of mineralizing carbon dioxide in mine tailings and industrial wastes. So we look at the reactivity of this material. The reactivity of the mineral materials is really fundamentally important, and Peter Kellerman gave a wonderful overview of that in a previous segment in this series. We look at this a little bit differently. We have sort of a hierarchy of reactivity. Peter talked a lot about the reactivity of minerals like olivine and wollastonite and pyroxene. We see that as one of only three different types of reaction that we focus on. In particular, we have minerals that are present in modest or trace amount oxide and hydroxide minerals that are highly reactive. One example of this would be brucite, which can be quite common in some ultramafic mine tailings. We also focus on surface reaction processes within platy minerals or sheet silicate minerals or clays. So these minerals have really high surface area, and they can be really important in reaction in terms of surface complexation reactions and cation exchange reactions, and can as a result be a significant source of metals for these reactions. So we're not just looking at bulk dissolution of the minerals in the way that other people have. We look at surface processes as well. We also look at this hierarchy of reactivity in terms of the reactivity of the minerals on a bulk basis, not on a unit surface area basis, because different minerals have very different surface areas. And so we believe that it's important to look at this on a per gram or a per mass unit of the minerals. And when you do that, we find that both these surface reactions as well as the oxide and hydroxide minerals react much more quickly than minerals like olivine or wollastonite, some of the others that are the focus in other processes for carbon mineralization. So I want to use this hierarchy to talk a little bit about what we see as the opportunities for carbon mineralization. So we have four types of geologic deposits or occurrences that can host commodities and metals that can be important, that all are hosted in ultramafic rocks. They all ultimately come from molten ultramafic material that either crystallize at depth in the earth, and that would be the material that we see in the tectonized mantle or ophiolite. This is the type of rock types that Peter Kellerman has talked about and David Goldberg has talked about. We also have intrusions of these ultramafic materials that crystallize at depth within continental crust. These are important sources today of nickel, platinum group elements, chrome, copper, and cobalt. And there are two types of volcanic deposits of these materials. There's komatiites, which have occurred in Earth's distant past that are also very important hosts of nickel, for example. And then there's also extrusive ultramafic rocks called kimberlite that are the primary host of diamonds. So most diamond mines today are hosted in these ultramafic rocks. So these are examples of different types of geologic deposits that can be important hosts of mineralization that also provide opportunities for carbon removal from the atmosphere and mineralization. And I want to emphasize that across all four of these geologic types, we see specific deposits that have high contents of some of these oxide and hydroxide minerals, and so can be really important partners in deploying carbon removal and mineralization. So looking at this this hierarchy of reactivity, again on the left with bulk reaction of oxide and hydroxide minerals versus surface mineral reactions versus bulk silicate mineral reactions, kind of looking at them in the context of pathways to carbon dioxide removal through mineralization, and the technology required and the potential scale. So if we're just going to focus on the deposits that have these trace oxide and hydroxide minerals, such as brucite, they're a wonderful low-hanging fruit. We can deploy them at very low cost, low energy inputs, and they're highly reactive to CO2 and air. The global scale that we might be able to sequester or capture CO2 with these kinds of materials with mining as it occurs today is in the 1 to tens of millions of tons per year. We can increase that dramatically if we look at surface reaction of clay and sheet silicate minerals. These minerals can also be reactive to CO2 and air, especially upon chemical treatment or activation. And the deployment of that technology really raises the stakes here to hundreds of millions, potentially to gigaton per year, if we look at the rates of mining that are forecast to be happening by 2050 and beyond. And then ultimately, if we want to go to the bulk reaction of silicate minerals like olivine and wollastonite, like Peter Kellerman and others have talked about, we need significant chemical, biological, or mechanical activation, or we need to drive reaction in the deep subsurface where the temperature pressure conditions are more optimal for reaction. And that provides opportunities that are in the tens, honestly, in the hundreds or even thousands of gigatons per year. So that's technologically the most difficult thing to do and requires the most intervention, but it really offers the greatest long-term potential. Our focus is on trying to deploy technology that's available today to start to develop these carbon removal and mineralization credits on the scales of millions of tons per year within a time frame of the next 5 years, so that we can really ramp this up. So we're starting at the top of this list, and as we develop new technologies, we can work further down this ladder or this hierarchy of reactivity. Here's just some examples of some of the processes that we're looking at. So there's a graph here on the left that shows the rate of CO2 capture from air on a basis of kilograms of CO2 per square meter of tailings material on an annual basis. And this represent benchtop experiments that we run, and they really just emphasize that by treating and manipulating tailings and adding water, we can dramatically increase the rate of CO2 capture. And in this particular instance, with a single tailings manipulation at about 25 hours, the rates of carbon capture that we see of about 5 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared per year, if that rate were deployed at the scale of a large nickel mine, that would represent about 100,000 tons per year of CO2 capture from air and mineralization. So these manipulations can get us in the right frame of capacity to start generating significant carbon removal credits. There's a lot of chemical and physical controls on these reactions, and the important thing in terms of optimizing the rate of carbon capture from air within tailings storage facilities is to manage all of them together. They're difficult to completely isolate within controlled experiments. And so our approach has been to identify tools that we can use, monitoring techniques that allow us to essentially correct for and normalize rates for each of these different influences, such that we can optimize processes to generate high rates of carbon capture from air and to sustain them over long periods of time. And so this graph here is really just meant to emphasize the effect of one of these parameters on the horizontal axis and a dramatic increase in the flux of the rate of capture of CO2 from air as a function of just one of these chemical and physical controls. Really important aspect for us in order to not only optimize our process in light of those different controls on reaction, but also to provide the data that third parties need to verify trapped CO2 is a really robust scaffold of different technologies to demonstrate that the CO2 has been captured from air and mineralized. And so we have 3 different types of technologies that we use. One comes from geochemistry. It's essentially a measure of the total inorganic carbonate content of the material. So we can actually measure after a period of time how much CO2 has been added in solid mineral form within tailings through this geochemical analysis. But that's only one of the tools that we use to explore this. We also layer on top of that a couple of other techniques that really rely on mass balance in the gas phase. There's dynamic closed chambers as a technology commonly used in soil science, where we can isolate a volume of air against the surface of the tailings and measure the rate of CO2 drawdown into the tailings. So that measures the CO2 flux over a small area of a tenth of a square meter or so. And then we scaffold that together with eddy covariance systems, which are essentially weather towers that look at the covariance of the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere with the vertical component of turbulence within the air above to make measurements over thousands to tens of thousands of square meters. So we get measurements based on both geochemistry as well as CO2 concentration in air that have different footprints and use fundamentally different technologies. And the approach here is to apply them together and look for redundancy and verification of rates by using multiple technologies. So this is an example of one where we're looking at the rate of CO2 uptake in a 90-day experiment, an outdoor experiment where we used dynamic closed chambers. The DCC gives us essentially instantaneous measures of CO2 flux. So that's essentially the slopes of these lines. And then we can periodically actually sample the tailings and measure how much the CO2 content of the solid component of the tailings has increased over time. And that's a measurement of a cumulative amount after a certain period of time. And so when the slope of these lines, the solid line going up between 0 and 25 days here, matches, those are the DCC measurements. When they match the point measurements of TIC, when we get redundancy and agreement between those measurements, we get more confidence that we have a robust measure of the amount of CO2 capture and mineralization. This is an example of a data series from using both dynamic closed chambers and eddy covariance. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but we can certainly come back to it in the Q&A. This is really meant to emphasize the complexity of the system. So what we're seeing here are rate CO2 fluxes. In this case, positive is emission of CO2, negative is a capture of CO2. The gray bands that you see are data from dynamic closed chambers, an array of 9 chambers across a large area. From a manipulated tailing surface, the black is measurements of eddy covariance over that same surface, and the blue baseline is a chamber system for unmanipulated tailings. The gray vertical bands that you see here are nighttime, and the white vertical bands are daytime. And this is really to emphasize that we see here at diurnal cycles, we see the influence of weather systems like the rain event in the middle of the plot. So these are complex systems. The monitoring requires a careful understanding of what's going on, but we can see we have very robust measurement where the eddy covariance, which is measuring with black dots, is showing the flux is captured over thousands to tens of thousands of square meters, giving very strong and similar measurements to the fluxes that we get from the chambers, which are very small scale measurements. So again, we're getting the agreement of those measurements. We have these complex systems that we need to understand and integrate long-term rates in order to get robust measures of how much CO2 has been captured and mineralized over a time period of days of weeks to months. So that's where we're at. This is an example of an experiment we ran on a tailings storage facility where we're deploying, again, these chambers and these eddy covariance units. Basically, what we're doing is Carbon Minerals is partnering with active mines to start to set these systems out and deploy our technology to manipulate and manage the tailings and this tailings surface to sustain highly accelerated rates of CO2 capture and mineralization. Compare that against baseline rates so that we can show the net increase due to the activities that we deploy, and then through that provide carbon removal credits and demonstrate mineralization with that. So the monitoring and the verification is really critical, not only to the deployment of our technology, but also to validating the amount of captured carbon. So I thought what I would do is quickly end with just an idea of where we see this influencing the metals industry. So looking at nickel as an example, there's really 2 types of nickel. There's class 1 deposits and class 2. Class 2 is mostly laterite systems. Class 1 is mostly nickel sulfide systems. There are very different types of geologic deposits. This graph shows the carbon intensity of the mining, a ton CO2 equivalent per ton nickel equivalent of a whole series of different mines. And the important note here is that class 1 deposits are inherently lower carbon in their production. So they're going to be easy to decarbonize as an industry. Class 2 inherently have a high carbon footprint associated with mining. Class 1 type deposits are also the deposits that tend to be hosted within these ultramafic rocks that are reactive to CO2 and air. So we see an actual transformation in the nickel industry, moving away from these laterite systems and moving towards nickel sulfide systems that not only represent lower carbon footprint, they'd be easy to decarbonize mining activities on these deposits, and their tailings are also amenable to carbon minerals technologies to essentially produce a carbon negative mine. And so with my last slide, I'd like to give you an idea how we might achieve that. So there's the vertical bars in here are tons of CO2 per tons tailings per year for a number of different mines and tailings. The red bars show the carbon emissions associated with mining, either from the haul fleet or the truck emissions in dark red, or from electricity production and running the mineral processing units in the pink color. And in contrast, the blue vertical bars show the carbon sequestration capacity of the tailings. And this slide really is meant to emphasize that with the right types of mine operations, even today, the red bar that into the smallest of the red graphs to the left of center that shows renewable electricity generation and relatively modest truck emissions, that would be an example of an operating mine using hydroelectricity. With the tailings for those materials essentially can be sufficient to offset almost all carbon emissions. But if we decarbonize the haul fleet of those kinds of mines, we look at the mining scenarios of tomorrow. The mining industry is very active in deploying renewable electricity, and they're also developing a number of different technologies for decarbonizing their haul fleet. So as we look at nickel production into the future, the way we see the deployment of this technology is to marry the carbon capture from air and mineralization with tailings at mines where they've already have a very low carbon footprint nickel production because of the use of renewable electricity and the transformation of the haul fleet. And under the scenario we see on the right-hand side of this graph, we see a very strong potential for the development of nickel mines that not only completely decarbonize the supply chain of nickel for car batteries and other deployment, but also generate significant amounts of carbon removal credits and storage as mineralization. So with that, I will stop and open up the floor for questions.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Greg. And here's Paul. Good. That was really fascinating presentation. Love to start just by asking you both. Greg, you've been working on the science behind this for a long time. Can you talk about how the evolution of the idea of the applicability to carbon removal came about, when you started thinking about it? And, you know, carbon removal has obviously become more topical in recent years. And then Paul, also would love to hear from you about when you started thinking about carbon removal and how you came to join Carbin Minerals.
Sure,
go ahead, Greg.
I'll start off. Yeah, I started working in this over 20 years ago when people were looking at mining ultramafic rocks as feedstock for chemical reactors. And as we started to look at actual mine waste, we discovered that they were already carbonating. And in the initial, for a lot of the early work, we really saw it as a way of reducing the CO2 emissions of mine operations. And it's only in the last 5 years or so that it really clicked that it's much, that the capture of CO2 from air and mineralizing within tailings is an incredibly high value pathway to capture carbon and store it. So it doesn't make sense to use it instead of deployment of renewable electricity or instead of decarbonizing your haul fleet. It really makes the most sense, both economically and environmentally, to use it as a last resort and make the mines as low carbon as possible, and then allow for the supply chain of these metals to be completely decarbonized. And on top of that, generate carbon removal credits with durable storage. And that really has only clicked in the last 3 or 4 years. And I would say the mining industry is just catching on to that as well, and recognizing that the opportunity here is not one of using this instead of other technologies, but the importance of deploying this in addition to decarbonation of mine operations. And that has the opportunity to fundamentally change the role of mining in society and the reputation of mining in society if we can provide these critical metals at zero carbon and generate carbon removal credits as well.
Paul?
Yeah. Well, I'm relatively new to CDR. I've been working on climate for maybe 13, 15 years. I was focused on expanding access to clean energy in developing markets, in India in particular. And I guess, you know, I was attracted to that and to this because of this tension that I think we all recognize, that on the one hand, we need more energy. But we want to make sure that that's done in a way that that doesn't, not in the developing world needs far more energy than it has today, but they can't follow the same pathway that we have. So there's a tension there. We need to decarbonize, but we also need to expand access to opportunities for people. And there's the same tension here, I think, in the mining industry. We know that in order to succeed with our energy transition, we need 6 to 19 times more nickel, but we can't mine it the same way we used to. That needs to change, and mining itself needs to get to net zero. I was really excited to see that Tesla has now gone public with its purchase agreements. You have buyers, the users of our critical metals are companies that are positioning themselves in the world as sustainability leaders. So clearly they need net zero nickel. They need net zero critical metals. So they're putting pressure on the mining industry to produce those. Tesla with its advanced commitments to purchase nickel if it's sustainably mined. So I think what excited me about this company when I first met them was that not only can we create highly valuable, durable carbon removal credits, but there's also a pull from the mining industry that itself is on a journey of decarbonization and has this waste that turns out to be a resource in the tailings.
Excellent. This is a little bit of an audible, but something I've been thinking about that I think you would both have really interesting points of view on. One really great thing that's happening right now, I think, in the overall sector is an accelerating rate of ideas going from academia and research institutions to commercialization. Since you've just done that, like what if, and we do have people literally in the audience today who are doing that or thinking about it. Do you have any like 3 top tips of do's or don'ts to kind of, both from an entrepreneurial perspective and also to maximize the climate benefit that comes from this kind of dynamic? Don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that.
Well, I could comment on what we've done at the University of British Columbia. So I met Greg in my role as an entrepreneur in residence at the University of British Columbia. We have an entrepreneurship program called Entrepreneurship at UBC. It's a business incubator, business accelerator. And we found that, over the years, we were encountering only the researchers, the professors, the grad students that had already made a decision to start a business, that had already decided that was the pathway to impact that they wanted to have with their research. And so our doors were always open, but we weren't getting enough knocks on the doors with climate solutions. So we created a new program called the Climate Venture Studio within entrepreneurship at UBC, which was much more proactive at reaching out to researchers across the university to understand what they're working on and to explain this particular pathway to impact, and then provide support earlier on in the process. I think that's, Greg, how we first met when you were thinking about your pathway.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that program's been really critical for us to get going. The big switch for me has been, taking the inherent cautiousness and conservativeness of a scientist and turn that around into, in particular for looking at carbon removals, we have to get beyond the cautious, safe, conservative pathways. We need to be bold and get out there and try things that are risky, but could have a huge impact. And that's been that's a hard switch to make as someone who spent their career writing scientific papers and advancing research, but it's critically important for us, I think, as a community if we're going to find solutions, because we don't have the time to move slowly. We need to be bold and take action. And that's been a difficult transformation, but also I think a really important one to keep in mind as people look at this.
Yep. As we're going to market, you don't have to pre-qualify every assertion with every possible caveat. So yes, that's great. One question about MRV. It looks like you're initially working with ambient air in terms of your drawing down the CO2 from ambient air, and then as notional scale happens, it moves toward captured CO2, just a more concentrated stream. Is there a difference on the ease of MRV with ambient air versus captured CO2, already captured CO2? Is it easier with the latter, or are there leakage issues? Like, how do you look at those two things?
Yeah, that's a good question. We see a lot of the enhanced capacity developed with our secondary technology, still working for air capture. So that's our primary focus for the next while. That being said, we've worked with mining companies about injecting flue gas, and we see some great pathways to partnering with direct air capture companies and using CO2 like that to inject into tailings if you've buried reactivity before you've had a chance to react with the atmosphere. So both are important. To date, I would say that the MRV is easier for the air capture because you're essentially monitoring a surface, whereas once you're injecting into a volume, it's inherently a harder system to keep track of, and it's harder to get the redundancy on the different techniques. So our initial experience is that air capture is actually easier to monitor and verify than injection.
That's exactly opposite what I would have thought before listening to the presentation. That's very interesting. This is a little bit of a wonky question that might not make sense, but there are a couple of really promising electrochemical ocean CDR pathways that, as they scale, will generate tremendous volumes of HCl, hydrochloric acid. Is there any potential synergy there? Is it your process or an adaptation of your process? Could you actually use HCl in your process in a way that would, sort of balance out this removal of acidity from the ocean?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and it's I think an area that a lot of people are interested for good reasons. At one level, our technology produces very durable stored carbon as magnesium carbonate minerals, and there are very few release risks for that form of storage. But the one release risk that exists is treatment with high strength acids. So in some ways, a supply of hydrochloric acid represents our worst case scenario, because if we were to apply it to what we've already done, it actually presents a significant release risk. Really the only viable pathway realistically for release from stored CO2 in mineral form. That being said, a lot of the sort of class 2 in terms of hierarchy reactions that look at cation exchange and surface complexation, acids can be an important part of that process in chemical treatment systems, and there's a number of groups that are looking at that. So I think if you're there are potentially uses for the acid in that scenario, and that would really apply to a 2-stage process where you're generating the reactivity of the metals at one stage where the acid would be used, and then forming the carbonate minerals in a second stage through a pH swing or something like that. So I think we're focused right now on a 1-stage process, but in a 2-stage system, there definitely could be usage for the acids like that. The inherent challenge in those systems is always that if you dissolve a lot of magnesium through the application of hydrochloric acid or sulfuric acid, how do you get the magnesium to ultimately precipitate in a carbonate form and not as a magnesium chloride salt or as a magnesium sulfate? So the acids come with both the cations and the anions, and they generate some complexity in forming carbonates at the second stage, but obviously there are chemical processes that allow for that.
Got it. So not directly applicable to your current pathway and methodology, but yeah, notionally potentially applicable to different types of pathways or a future version of what you guys are doing. Got it. Can you talk briefly about you gave some numbers about scale potential globally. Can you give us an idea of how many potential sites globally or in North America, if that's easier, are we talking about that you could potentially deploy in? Like, what's the number, and is it 100,000 tons per average mine drawdown potential? Or I saw that number earlier in your presentation, just to give a sense of like how the scale could be distributed. Like, where are these things? How many of them are there, these mines?
Yeah, so I mean, it depends on the technology. So the early stages, when we're relying with deposits or mines that already have this inherently reactive material, we've been working with more than a dozen mining companies looking at deposits, many dozens of deposits around the world, and consistently finding that these deposits exist across all those different geologic types, from komatiites to intrusive ultramafics to ophiolitic systems. So they are there. In terms of operating mines, we're still in the process of determining how many there are, but there are enough to definitely get into the million ton per year level. Once we bring in the other technologies that activate the material, that actually greatly increases the number of sites that this can be applied to. It also increases the capacity and the rate. So that with that technology, you could see getting up to 1 million tons per year at a single mine, and you could be applying this to to quite a few mines, dozens of mines, and with the minerals growth that's projected, it would be many more if the focus of new mine development is in these rock types. That's the pathway to a gigaton.
And what's at the gigaton scale? What is the order of magnitude of the number of potential mines? Is it 10,000, 100,000? Like, just roughly, do you have any idea?
Yeah, so if we can get individual large nickel mines up to 1 million tons per year, then we would need 1,000 of them to get to a gigaton.
Okay. One last question, and then we have a bunch of audience questions, and please keep those coming. One of the things at OpenAir that we think about a lot when we think about carbon removal is equity and environmental justice, just because it's important morally, it's important politically. We are completely remaking our economy, and we have an opportunity to do it in a way that is a lot more just and equitable than the fossil economy has been for many people. Mining already has a range of negative externality and environmental injustice concerns associated with it that carbon minerals and carbon removal have absolutely nothing to do with. That said, if you're going to integrate with that ecosystem, it's something that you do have to think about and address. Like, how do you think about it? And are there potential incremental harms from what you're doing that could affect surrounding communities? Are there benefits? And then how would you plan to communicate those to the people near your deployments?
Yeah, I'll comment on that. I mean, this is obviously an area we're looking into closely now. First of all, it's about partner selection. So we've been approached by a number of mining companies, and it became really clear to us quickly that we needed a framework for thinking about who to work with and who not, because we got some calls from some interesting companies from all corners of the planet, some places that we knew we didn't want to work right away. So we've been examining that and taking some advice on that as well. The mining industry has been grappling with these questions of sustainability and community engagement and conservation of biodiversity and water and health and safety. And there's a number of groups. I mean, I'd bias towards groups like International Institute for Sustainable Development, World Resources Institute. There's some industry-led groups like Towards Sustainable Mining, and the International Council for Mining and Metals has a set of sustainability and responsible mining principles. So we're doing our work to kind of understand what frameworks are already there and which ones are most credible. And that will guide our partner selection and guide how we work with those partners and with the communities around where they work as well. In the context of Canada, the First Nations are, of course, critical partners where you need to go to first. So, one approach that we're looking at is actually, instead of starting with the mining companies and then figuring out which communities we might be impacting, actually start with the communities and then figure out, well, which mines in the area might be relevant.
And just from a process perspective, in terms of what carbon minerals actually does, are there any ways in which you exacerbate the existing negative externality and harms that mines are doing, like by stirring up dust or whatever that might be? And or do you help with the remediation and that you are kind of neutralizing potentially hazardous materials with what you're doing? Is there any thoughts on that?
Greg?
Yeah, there are both opportunities and risks there, and those are areas that a number of groups have looked at. Obviously, really important for us as we develop and establish our partnerships with operating mines, that we have to be able to work within their existing health and safety protocols, which are very stringent and are incredibly important as key performance indicators for operating mines. So it's something that we're very, very cognizant of. We do know that these carbonate minerals can, in some cases, encapsulate toxic metals, and they can help remediate problems. They can also cement the tailings and help improve their mechanical stability. But in areas where there's a potential of a seismic risk, that cementation needs to be of a certain type. And so there are risks there that have to be understood and managed, and dust production is also one of them. So it's a combination of risks that we have to understand and mitigate, and those are first order points of contact with the mining companies that we collaborate with, because they're of fundamental importance to them as well.
Got it. Excellent. Want to hop now to the audience questions. I think Megha will come on, and she's been looking through those and sorting them, and we'll ask you those. But thank you very much.
Hey, great. So yeah, we do have a lot of audience questions. I'm going to start with one that just kind of follows on quite closely from what you were just talking about. So the question is, if you look at the vegetation around tailing dumps and how that affects things like dust control for reduction of lung diseases, things like that, do your techniques have any specific, positive or negative effect on vegetation? And, how do you study that?
Yeah, there's not really any impact there in the directly within the tailings storage facility because there's virtually no vegetation. These are continuously resurfaced with fresh tailings, so there's really no, beyond a little bit of algal mats, there's really no biology happening within the tailings storage facility. And then in terms of their dust impacts from the tailings storage facility, if from our treatment, that would be proportional to any increase in dust generation or reduction in dust generation that might result from our activities. Because we're actually managing water content, we see an opportunity here to help mitigate dust production, not to actually generate more. But that would really be the only way that we could see impacting the plants. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Makes sense. We had a couple of questions around sort of like different opportunities that you might be thinking about. So one is, where is alumina/aluminum on your priority list, and what opportunities could there be around red mud?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. There's been a number of groups that have looked at red mud for this kind of process. It has the alkalinity, which is great for the carbon capture. It doesn't always have a great ability to generate the metals you need to make the carbonate minerals. So I see it as, that is something that I think there's a whole bunch of other alkaline waste streams that I think are going to be really interesting in this space. We view such a great opportunity around Ultramafic hosted critical and battery metals that's our primary focus, but this technology will definitely be able to move into other sectors, and it'll require some adjustments to do that. But I would say red mud's harder to tackle. It's got greater alkalinity, but it doesn't have the reactivity that the Ultramafic material does, at least for our technologies.
Okay, got it. And another one, which I think is close to the hearts of a lot of open air people. We have a lot of members out in New York, and northern New York State is home to one of North America's only wollastonite mines. Have you looked into that at all? I think that would produce surface level tailings. So, is that an opportunity for you? Apparently, it has one of the fastest mineralization rates of any rock on Earth. So, would that be compatible with the kind of technology that you have?
Yeah, it's similar to olivine, a little bit more. The textbook values are that it's a little bit more reactive than olivine. Those textbook values are always based on a per mineral surface area rate, whereas we find because different minerals have different habits, they'll have hugely different surface area on a per gram or per ton basis. So when you actually look at the reactivity of the minerals on that basis, that's why these oxide and hydroxide and these surface reactions are much, much faster than olivine and wollastonite. So wollastonite is not a strong driver of capture of CO2 from air using the kinds of techniques that we use. That doesn't mean that there's opportunities there, but it's definitely down the list. And also, I think as Peter Kellerman and others have noticed and have mentioned, there's not huge amounts of that mineral. There are some interesting opportunities there. It's a common mineral in skarn systems, and there's some significant mines operating in skarn systems around the world. So it is a mineral that will be useful, I think, down the road. But right now, we're focused on minerals that have inherently really, really high surface area, like serpentine and brucite and other clay minerals.
Okay, got it. And then one last question on sort of these types of opportunities. Do you have any experience in CDR using tailings from open cast coal mining?
Short answer is no.
Okay, fair enough. Short and sweet. Great. Well, we have a bunch of questions on the process, so maybe I'll start asking a little bit of those. So could you talk through a little bit of the reaction materials that you use throughout the process, and sort of things like, the importance of temperature, pressure, other factors, and kind of how that moves end to end throughout the process?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. We operate at ambient conditions, so we don't have a footprint or a energy cost associated with trying to manage temperature and pressure, because we essentially operate at the conditions that exist. And we've done field experiments and lab experiments under a wide range of conditions from in winter and summer conditions on multiple continents. And there's a really complex control of both climate and weather on the rates. And it's not unidirectional. You know, the solubility of CO2 is increased substantially at low temperature. So there are, in some manifestations, low temperature is actually very good for CO2 capture because of the increase of the solubility of the CO2 in the water phase. Once things are frozen and covered with snow, they shut down. But we've had some incredibly successful experiments run under winter months in Vancouver with very high capture rates that are on the same magnitude as the rates that we can get in the summer. So because there's the interplay of these different physical and chemical controls, it's not a simple answer. It's more about managing a process to take advantage of what the ambient conditions are. But we think we can sustain high rates of capture as long as we're above freezing.
Oh yeah, okay, that's interesting because I think someone also asked, about the diurnal cycle that you mentioned and saying that the daytime flux rates were higher. So I guess it's maybe not the temperature that's driving that. Is there something else behind it?
Yeah, I mean, temperature and rate of temperature change is a first order control. Obviously, if you're evaporating pore films, you're going to release the CO2 that's there. So there's a number of things affecting things there. Humidity and CO2 concentration in air is a lot more variable than you might think in the real world environments, and that has a first order control as well. So there's a number of things going on. Those diurnal cycles are very common. And they really emphasize the importance of continuous monitoring and understanding the system in the long term, because if you take a series of spot measurements, the data will be virtually useless for understanding the long-term rate of CO2 capture. But we think we can, by understanding those diurnal cycles, we can actually use them to our advantage. And that's one of the things we do to optimize our rate of capture.
Okay,
Paul, you may have had a comment.
Yeah, I just want to add to that and go back to the three different categories of technologies that we're advancing and how they interact. Greg went into depth on the monitoring and verification technologies, and these are super important that we develop ways in which we can measure CO2 mineralization in more or less real time over a larger area. So the monitoring and verification technologies is category one. The category two is the manipulation technologies, effectively stirring up and churning up the tailings to increase the reactivity. But those two technologies need to work together, and that's really where the magic is you get microclimates across the tailings facility. You get different conditions across the tailings facility. So knowing when and where to direct your manipulation activity to optimize the rate of CO2 capture. That's really key. So the monitoring and verification technologies are important, not just because we want to really know what's happening and monetize it, but also because it helps us do the manipulation better. And then the third category, which is still more at lab scale, is a pre-treatment of the material before it's set out. And that's probably at a TRL 3 or 4 right now. So much more work to be done there. But combined, we're seeing this 5 to 50x increase.
Okay, got it. I'll just do a couple more questions because I know we're getting towards the end of our time. So when you talked about scaling up, I know you discussed a little bit of what that looks like. Could you talk a little bit about what are the biggest challenges or obstacles you see? I know, OpenAir members are obviously very interested in some of the research and policy questions, but, including those or anything else, what are the biggest challenges you face?
In scaling up?
Yeah, scaling up. I think moving
scale.
with speed. The best mining companies tend to be very large. The ones that are most committed to sustainability tend to be large and global players, and decision making therefore is more complex. But we're certainly seeing a pull from the mining industry to get out and do some commercial pilots. So we're working through those relationships. We don't have capacity to do 10 pilots, so we want to be selective, and there's a need to be careful about our partner selection there. But yeah, we'd like to move faster. We're a startup and we're partnering with very large companies, so which rightly have established processes.
Okay, right. Makes sense. I'll just do one last one before I hand it back over to Toby. So this person asks, are you looking for partnerships with carbon capture companies and researchers in Canada? And if so, what's the best way to get in touch? And, generally for people interested in following your work or learning more, what's the best way?
Greg?
Sure. Yeah, no, I think, I think it's really important for our community to be building these connections and collaborations, because a single approach and a single technology isn't going to solve it all. And we see clear ways that there's neat things we can do in tailings with pre-concentrated CO2 in addition to capturing from air. So the last slide that we had there had some contact information, but we're a small company. We're only 5 people right now, so the people you see are the people that you would talk to. And if we'd love to talk to other companies about ways to work together and develop additional pathways to help achieve carbon dioxide removal.
Great. And like I said, I think that will be up. The recording will be up on YouTube eventually, so anyone who's interested in that last slide can find it there. Thank you guys so much. And Toby, I will give it back to you to finish us up.
Thank you, Megha. And thank you to the audience for all the great questions, and especially to Greg and Paul for being with us today. That was an excellent presentation. It was super exciting and interesting for us to learn more about what you guys are doing. And also I don't think we said it enough, but congratulations on all your recent success and unveiling with the Shopify purchase and the X Prize Milestone Award. That's amazing. Amazing accomplishments for you guys. So thank you again. I'm going to do a couple quick programming notes about what we have coming up with OpenAir, and then we'll be wrapping up. Actually, later this week, there's a really important activist workshop. It's at noon Eastern on Thursday. Many of you are aware of the Federal Carbon Dioxide Removal Leadership Act. It's now a live piece of legislation in both houses of Congress. OpenAir is going to be coordinating with a couple of other organizations a lobbying push to get individual citizen advocates to contact their local representatives, their local U.S. representatives, to get them to support this really important piece of legislation. So link in the chat, please join us. We've got pretty great bookings coming up this summer on This Is CDR. Next week, we have Captura, which is an electrochemical ocean CDR company, another X Prize Milestone Awardee with a new CEO, Steve Oldham, who's the former CEO of Carbon Engineering. On the 21st, we have Zeke Hausbather from Frontier Climate, which is super exciting. He's going to talk a little bit about Frontier, which I think we're all pretty familiar with at this point. And I'm really interested to hear his thoughts on what he calls the brutal math of carbon removal that basically illustrate how and why we need it. On the 28th, we have an innovative direct air capture startup from Finland that is in market deploying machines, which is, I think, a pretty rare thing, Solitaire, and they integrate direct air capture with building HVAC systems. So basically helping decarbonize our building stock, which is really important. And also there are a lot of benefits to the people inside the buildings from reducing the CO2 concentration in the internal air. And then there's a list of what we've got booked for July, August. Those Eventbrites will be live soon. There's a link in the chat to all of the sessions, so please register and join us. That's it for today. I want to thank Paul and Greg again for being with us, and thanks to you all for joining us, and we will see you next week. Be well.